Baptism of fire. After days of constant vibration, the silence felt unnatural. For nearly a week the ship's engines had ground without pause, a mechanical presence so constant it became part of a man's breathing. Now they were quiet, and the Atlantic off North Africa lay uneasy and dark. The stillness did not last. In the early hours before dawn, bells clanged sharply through the passageways. An anchor chain roared as it ran free. Orders were shouted, short, clipped, urgent. Boots hammered steel decks as men moved at a run. Power winches screamed to life, swinging landing craft outward and lowering them into white-capped water that slapped hard against the hulls. The moment every man had waited for, and half hoped might be delayed, had arrived. A radio was playing somewhere nearby, its signal fading in and out over the noise. Lieutenant Maurice Footsey. Britt paused when he recognized the voice. It was Franklin D. Roosevelt, calmly announcing to the American public that the invasion of North Africa had already begun. Britt found the timing strange, almost absurd. They were still 8 miles from shore. Nothing yet had happened to them. It felt as though the world had leapt ahead of reality. Years later, Britt would remember thinking the president had jumped the gun, but there was no time to dwell on it. The announcement faded into the background as the machinery and shouting closed in again. Britt took his place in his assigned landing craft, his bulk filling the narrow space. The ramp clanged shut. The craft lurched forward, its engines straining as it peeled away from the transport and headed toward a coastline none of them knew. Ahead, the sea was crowded. Transports dotted the horizon in every direction, dark shapes against the paling sky. Britt belonged to the 3rd Infantry Division, 30th Infantry Regiment, men who called themselves Marne men, heirs to a unit that carried a long and demanding history. He was one of roughly 35,000 American soldiers in the Western Task Force, commanded by George S. Patton, one of 3 Allied forces striking French Morocco and Algeria along a coastline stretching nearly 1,000 miles, from Safi on the Atlantic to Algiers in the east. Almost all of them were untested. They were crossing from theory into reality together, about to become the first American ground troops to fight the Axis in Europe. The timing could not have been more critical. For nearly 2 years, Axis forces had dominated North Africa. The British 8th Army had suffered repeated defeats, pushed back again and again across desert and wire. But less than a week earlier, the momentum had finally shifted. At El Alamein, Erwin Rommel and his Africa Corps had been stopped and beaten, forced onto the defensive for the first time. Now the Americans were entering a war already shaped by exhaustion, pride, and loss. They were not arriving as conquerors, but as latecomers stepping into a campaign whose rules had already been written in blood. For Britt and the men around him, none of that mattered yet. All they knew was that the shoreline was drawing closer, and whatever waited, there was no longer abstract. In total, Operation Torch was an immense gamble. It was the first truly joint operation of the war between the Americans and the British, involving more than 100,000 Allied troops and supported by some 350 warships drawn from 7 different navies. Never before had the United States attempted an amphibious landing on this scale. In the days before the assault, American commanders had worked urgently to avoid bloodshed, opening quiet channels to the French authorities in North Africa in the hope of negotiating an armistice. The effort failed. Vichy loyalties held. With no agreement in hand, a blunt order filtered down through the chain of command to Britt's division. Simple, final and unmistakable. The landings were on. As dawn broke, the darkness thinned into a pale, uncertain light. Off the coast, men strained their eyes toward land for the first time. In the distance, a single steeple rose above the low buildings of Fedala, a fragile landmark against the spreading sky. Then the illusion of calm shattered. Machine guns opened up somewhere ahead. Red tracer rounds streaked low and fast, tearing across the brightening horizon. The landing beach revealed itself, a wide, flat stretch of sand a few miles east of the port, completely exposed, with no shelter and no concealment. The sound reached Brit before the sight. Aircraft engines, deep and insistent. French bombers appeared overhead, and moments later bombs fell into the water, throwing up towering columns of white spray. At first, Brit thought it was almost beautiful, a distant spectacle detached from him. Then the realization struck, cold and unmistakable. These men were not posturing. They were attacking. The aircraft overhead were trying to kill them. In that instant, Brit understood something no amount of training had prepared him for. A soldier is not made by lectures or drills. He is made the moment he comprehends, fully and without illusion, that the fire he hears is meant for him. The landing craft slammed into the sand with a jolt. The ramp dropped. Men surged forward, beginning to unload vehicles and equipment under shouted orders. Then the air filled with the violent, tearing sound of gunfire. Brit looked up in time to see a French plane diving low, strafing the beach and ripping through the formation of his regiment. There had been no preliminary bombardment. American planners had deliberately held back, hoping restraint would prevent French resistance. Some of the men had even brought American flags ashore, believing the sight of them might stay French hands. It did not. Unloading stopped instantly. Brit and his men broke for the relative safety of movement, sprinting across open sand, then pushing inland away from the waterline. By midday, they reached a designated assembly area near a road bridge, shaken but intact. The landing, however, was unfinished. Brit turned back toward the beach with a sergeant, determined to recover the jeeps and weapons left behind in the chaos. By then, the first rush of adrenaline had faded. When another aircraft swept in low, Brit threw himself flat, clawing desperately at the sand, gripped by a sudden, overwhelming fear. The excitement was gone. What remained was terror, raw and unfiltered, and the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The aircraft passed on, its engine noise thinning into the distance. Brit did not move. For 5 long minutes he lay pressed into the sand, face down, heart racing, aware of his own breathing and little else. The beach felt vast and empty, as if it had swallowed him. Getting back to his feet required effort, not of muscle but of will. When he finally rose, he found his landing craft again, battered by the surf but still there. With a sergeant, he began stripping what they could. Guns first, then the last 2 jeeps, working quickly, knowing the sea was turning against them. They were too late. A wave lifted the craft, twisted it, and then it was gone, swallowed by rough water before they could save more than fragments. Worse news followed. A submarine torpedo had struck their transport offshore. The ship went down with nearly everything the regiment owned: barracks bags, food supplies, field kitchens, spare equipment. Overnight, a modern infantry unit had been reduced to what men could carry on their bodies. Brit absorbed it in stunned silence. They were tired, nauseated, angry, and soaked through, standing on a hostile shore with no shelter and no margin. There was nothing to do but turn back inland. Britt and the sergeant walked across the same open beach, rejoining their company near the road bridge, empty-handed. By early afternoon, Fedala was secured. The fight drained away as abruptly as it had begun. Britt's company fell into column and started the long march toward Casablanca, 16 miles to the southwest. The regiment met little organized resistance along the way, gathering up dozens of French prisoners, men who only hours earlier had been firing on them. The invasion had not unfolded as planned, but it had worked. Within 48 hours, Allied Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower negotiated a ceasefire with Vichy French forces. Casablanca fell with fewer than 70 men killed from Britt's division, though across Morocco the fighting left roughly 1,500 Allied casualties. In 2 compressed, disorienting days, the Marne men had learned what combat actually meant. Confusion, loss, fear, and improvisation, while leading the first American invasion of the war with little armored support and no prior experience to fall back on. Britt understood that this was only an introduction. Far worse lay ahead. Yet he was not unprepared in the way many junior officers were. Long before North Africa, he had been hardened by necessity. He had grown up poor in rural Arkansas, in the rice country around Carlisle, where optimism was less a temperament than a survival skill. Death was not an abstraction to him. When he was 9, his father was badly injured in an industrial accident and told he had fewer than 5 years to live. He lasted 4. Britt learned early what endurance looked like, watching it fail and then learning to live without it. Those lessons, forged long before the sound of aircraft engines and tracer fire, would matter more in the months ahead than anything he had yet experienced on the beaches of North Africa. Britt's mother was left alone with 2 boys, Basil, 9, and Maurice, 13, and no margin for error. Every cent mattered. Survival was arithmetic. Britt worked whenever and wherever he could, stacking wood, picking fruit, chopping cotton under a sun that did not care how old he was or how tired he felt. Labor was not something he learned later in life. It was the constant background of his adolescence. By the time he reached high school, effort had already become habit. He excelled at nearly everything physical: basketball, football, track, and his teammates noticed his outsized feet long before they noticed his leadership. They called him Footsie, size 12, double E. The name stuck. What mattered more was that he studied as hard as he worked. In 1937, Britt graduated as his high school's valedictorian, a distinction that carried real weight in a household where education represented escape. He never forgot his mother's reaction when he won a football scholarship to the University of Arkansas. He majored in journalism, imagining a future as a sports writer if professional athletics proved unreachable. Once again, he refused to choose between mind and body. He became both a standout student and a key player for the Razorbacks, a fast, intelligent end trusted on both offense and defense. His grades were exceptional. By his freshman year, he carried a 5.5 average. Yet football never slipped. Before his senior year, he attended reserve officers' training at Fort Leavenworth, an experience he would later describe, standing on the edge of combat, as priceless. At 22, Britt fell in love. Nancy Mitchell was young, spirited, and full of certainty about the future. After Britt received his commission as a second lieutenant, they married on June 8, 1941. In retrospect, the timing felt almost unreal. Life, Britt later recalled, was calm and uncomplicated in those months before Pearl Harbor. They honeymooned through the Ozarks, then headed north to Detroit, where Britt had been invited to try out for a professional football team. He made it. one of 6 roster spots, a starting position. In a matter of weeks, he was playing in the National Football League with the Detroit Lions. The Lions were not a successful team. They lost far more than they won. But Britt earned something more durable than victories. Teammates and fans respected him for his endurance and discipline. He played the full 60 minutes, absorbed punishment without complaint, and kept coming back. One teammate later said Britt could take any amount of pain and never fold. Another remembered thinking, even then, that he would make a leader. Britt shared a locker room with Byron White, already rumored to be the highest-paid player in the league, and clearly destined for a life beyond football. Britt saw it immediately. White, he thought, was going places. So was he. But history intervened. A few weeks before the end of the '41 season, a letter arrived from the War Department. Britt was being called to active duty. Football ended abruptly. On December 5th, he reported to Camp Robinson and was ordered west to Fort Lewis. He and Nancy drove across the desert together. Somewhere in Arizona, the radio cut through the monotony with breaking news. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The United States was at war. In that moment, Britt understood that the direction of his life had shifted again. This time not by choice, talent, or effort, but by necessity. Britt was certain his destination would be the Pacific. The war, as it appeared in December 1941, pointed west. His first instinct was practical and immediate. He considered pulling his coupe over in the next town and sending Nancy home, sparing her the rest of the journey. She refused. She insisted on going with him as far as the road would allow. They crossed the Rockies together, the miles eaten up at speed. Britt drove as if time itself were the enemy, his foot heavy on the accelerator, his thoughts already ahead of him. Police stopped him more than once for speeding. Each time, he explained, earnestly, without irony, that he was in a hurry to get the war won. He was waved on, no tickets, no delays. At Fort Lewis, the Army decided his future in minutes. An officer from a tank unit looked him over, 6 feet 3½ inches, broad, solid, and shook his head. Britt was too big for armor. Infantry, the officer said. That was where he would be useful. And so Britt found himself assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, a formation whose reputation weighed heavily on any man who joined it. Known as the Rock of the Marne, the division had helped stop the last great German offensive in July 1918, saving Paris when the line was breaking. Its soldiers wore blue and white stripes on their insignia and were known with a mixture of pride and menace as the Blue and White Devils. Between the wars, the division's roles had included officers like Dwight D. Eisenhower and George Marshall. Britt was joining a unit that carried memory as much as muscle. By November 1942, with Adolf Hitler rushing reinforcements to North Africa to stabilize Afrika Korps, Britt's war briefly slowed into monotony. His battalion was assigned security duties in Casablanca, guarding one of the most consequential meetings of the conflict. It was unglamorous work, standing posts, checking perimeters, but it placed Britt close to the center of Allied decision-making. When time allowed, he and his men bartered with local Arabs for food to supplement their rations. Eggs became currency. One soldier had arrived with a box of red, white, and blue poker chips. The locals valued them more than silver coins. For a short while, that man controlled the egg supply. From January 8th to January 23rd of 1943, the Marne men formed a tight cordon around the Anfa Hotel, an elegant coastal refuge where Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt, along with their senior commanders, debated how the war would be fought next. Britt stood watch as strategy hardened into policy. He later learned that he had personally encountered not only Roosevelt and Churchill, but Charles de Gaulle, Marshall, and others whose decisions would shape the rest of the war. The very operation that had brought Britt to Africa had been deeply controversial. Many American chiefs of staff viewed the North African landings as a dangerous distraction, a Mediterranean sideshow that served British imperial interests more than American strategy. But Roosevelt was under mounting pressure. A cross-channel invasion in 1942 was impossible, despite Soviet demands for a second front. Momentum mattered. To keep the initiative, Roosevelt accepted Churchill's argument for striking the so-called soft underbelly of the Third Reich through the Mediterranean. At Casablanca, another decision was made, one that would remove all ambiguity from the war's end. There would be no negotiations, no compromise. The Axis powers would be required to surrender unconditionally. For men like Britt, standing guard outside hotel walls, the consequences of that declaration were still abstract. They would not remain so for long. Once the conference ended and the dignitaries departed, Casablanca lost its brief sense of importance. Britt and his battalion moved on, leaving behind a city that had already begun to feel heavy and worn. Ancient Medinas packed tight against one another, bitter chicory coffee that churned the stomach, lines of beggars at every turn, and French colonials whose hostility was rarely concealed. Orders sent them north toward the Spanish-Moroccan border, a bleak windswept stretch where the work reverted to guard duty and routine. Spring came slowly. Nights grew less cold. Men no longer stamped their feet to keep warm as they stood sentry, but the waiting remained, stretching days into weeks. On March 7th, 1943, everything changed. The division received a new commander, Lucian Truscott. He was 48 years old, a chain smoker with sharp eyes and a reputation that preceded him. Truscott was an aesthete by temperament, a former schoolteacher from Texas, the son of a country doctor. At 23, he had enlisted in the cavalry and gone on to become an exceptional polo player. He carried books, War and Peace among them, and a bottle of liquor in his kit bag. He was also famously short-tempered, inflexible, and ruthless about discipline. Men who wounded themselves to avoid combat would receive 50-year sentences. There would be no softness under his command. Truscott assumed leadership at a dangerous moment. Operation Torch had not delivered the swift victory Allied planners hoped for. Erwin Rommel's forces proved stubborn and resilient. Rain soaked the countryside, mosquitoes plagued the camps, and thick mud along coastal roads bogged down Allied armor. Then came disaster. At Kasserine Pass, German forces smashed into inexperienced American units. 6 U.S. battalions were effectively destroyed in 48 hours. The defeat was humiliating and impossible to ignore. British officers muttered openly. American confidence took a blow. Yet Kasserine did what peacetime training could not. It exposed weakness and forced change. Commands were reshuffled, careers ended, new leaders were elevated. By the spring of 1943, the Allies began to recover their footing. Organization improved. Coordination tightened. Enemy shipping across the Mediterranean was being sunk at unprecedented rates, slowly strangling Axis supply lines. On April 27, the Allies launched a final offensive. Tunis fell. 2 once formidable German panzer armies collapsed, and by May 13th, the remnants of the Africa Corps surrendered. 238,000 German and Italian troops went into captivity. North Africa was finished. Truscott wasted no time. He assembled his officers and stripped away illusion. The Germans, he told them, were not supermen. They could be beaten if American soldiers were daring, disciplined, and relentlessly aggressive. He referred to the enemy simply as the Boche, without mystique or reverence. Barely a week later, he issued new orders. The division was to move to Arzew, a coastal training area in Algeria. While Rommel's forces were being driven back and destroyed in Tunisia, Britt recalled, the Marne men were preparing for something else entirely. Over and over again they practiced amphibious landings. The work was dangerous. Boats capsized. Men were injured. Combat teams were formed largely from volunteers. There was no extra pay, only expectation. Truscott drove the division hard. He demanded speed above comfort, endurance above regulation. Regimental commanders were ordered to conduct long forced marches at maximum pace, training men to move as fast as cavalry on foot. It became known as the Truscott Trot. The Army manual prescribed a march rate of 2.5 miles per hour. Truscott demanded 4. When a colonel tried to cite the manual, Truscott cut him off. The book was irrelevant. It could be thrown away. What mattered was what lay ahead, and whether the men would be fast enough, tough enough, and aggressive enough to survive it. Truscott's purpose was simple and uncompromising. Men were to move fast, faster than doctrine allowed, faster than comfort permitted. Infantry, he believed, had to think and maneuver like cavalry, covering ground at speed, pivoting sharply, striking before the enemy could settle. He knew what was coming. The Allies' next amphibious operation would be fought in brutal summer heat, across broken terrain where tanks would struggle and foot soldiers would decide the outcome. That decision had already been made far above Britt's rank. In guarded rooms at Casablanca, the objective was clear. The Marne men were going to Sicily. By late June, the pace finally eased. Britt and his company were allowed a brief pause after months of relentless preparation. They were in extraordinary physical condition, hardened by forced marches, constant drills, and the expectation of violence. Britt would later reflect that they were better conditioned for killing at that moment than at any other time in the war. On July 3rd, 1943, he stood in a parched olive grove in Tunisia as officers from the 3rd Infantry Division gathered in a wide semicircle. It was late afternoon. Faces were dark with sun and dust. Uniforms were stiff with dried sweat. Many men lowered themselves onto their helmets, seeking what little shade the olive trees could offer. The Division Desenvolvido Chief of Staff, Colonel Don Carleton, stepped forward. He was heavy-set, his face deeply sunburned, a thick mustache bristling as he leaned toward the microphone. A sudden gust of hot wind swept through the grove, carrying fine grit with it. Carleton paused, then spoke. It was the first Sirocco, he said. A wind borne over the Sahara, carrying furnace heat northward until it died over the Mediterranean. He called it a good omen. A few men laughed thinly. Most simply listened, conserving energy. Then the mood shifted. Carleton glanced to the side and straightened. General Lucian Truscott was approaching. The order rang out. Attention. Men scrambled to their feet, helmets in hand, lines snapping into rough order beneath the sun. Truscott stepped up to the microphone. The light caught his broad face, forcing him to squint. He did not waste words. They were on the eve of a great adventure, he told them. The greatest amphibious expedition the world had ever seen. Some men might speak of success or failure. He rejected the distinction. There would be success, or success beyond their utmost expectations. Failure, he said flatly, was not a word they recognized. The following day was the 4th of July, Independence Day. Truscott spoke again, this time without ceremony, directing his words at every man wearing blue and white stripes. They were about to meet the enemy face to face. The Boche. There was no talk of glory, no appeal to history. His instruction was blunt, almost savage in its simplicity. They were to carve their names into the enemy. For Britt, standing among men he had trained beside for months, the message was unmistakable. The waiting was over. Whatever had begun on a confused beach at Fedala was about to be tested again, this time against a prepared enemy, on ground that would offer no mercy.